Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show. The Atheist Experience is live, May 11th, 2003. I'm your host, Martin Wagner. Ashley Perrien, my co-host. And our guest today is Brian Bossell. Thanks for being on the show. Brian is a UT student. He's a religious studies major on his way to a PhD in that field. And Brian's here to talk to us today about why an atheist would want to study that field and get into that as a profession. And I'm very happy to have you on.
I'm happy to be here.
Should be good. Very interesting conversation. I have no idea if we had opening music. I'm just going to,
assume we did.
Take that on faith. Anyway, this show is sponsored by Atheist Community of Austin. We're a nonprofit educational organization promoting positive atheism and the separation of church and state. ACA has weekly meetings every Sunday morning at Hot Jumbo Bagels, which is located downtown at 307 West 5th Street, except for the first Sunday of every month, when we have our lecture series in the Mayor Room of the Austin History Center, located at 9th and Guadalupe. Our next lecture will be June 1st, and our speaker will be Don Baker, talking about the implications of viewing Christianity as a meme, which should be a very interesting topic. And as I understand it, I've just checked the website, and we've got our speakers lined up through August, which shows unusual organization on our part. So that's kind of neat. Okay, what else does ACA do? Well, we have Godless Gamers, which takes place every Monday night at 7 o'clock p.m. at the home of Russell and Virginia Glasser, and ACA Happy Hour, which takes place every Thursday evening at Antonio's Tex-Mex near the intersection of 183 and I-35. Starts about 7:30ish, but people trickle in most of the evening, so there's no real set time for that. But a little evening social gathering. Okay, I actually have stuff written down today on my thing.
It's not blank this time,
Yeah,
people.
You can't blow my cover like you did last week. The nonprofits, the ACA's internet radio show, which is now bi-weekly. Second season premiered yesterday. The next show will be on the 24th, and that is at atheistnetwork.com. It's an MP3 stream. Something happened yesterday that they weren't able to go out live.
Yeah, I think it was just technical issues at the last minute type thing.
But the show did get recorded, and it's archived, and maybe
on the website.
Maybe they'll figure that out next Sunday. They'll be live, and I don't know if the chat room is still a feature at atheistnetwork.com, but maybe it is.
I would expect it is. It didn't happen yesterday, obviously, because they weren't on live at least.
Well, I've recently. Last time I went to atheistnetwork.com, just went to the webpage. It's not the same website. It just takes you right to the Infidel Guy website. So I guess he's combined everything. And the way he has it set up is a little less intuitive, a little less easy to follow than it was previously.
It took me a little while to get my way around.
It's this little box on the side. Yeah. So, but then once you have the file, you can just open up iTunes if you're lucky enough to have iTunes and just listen to it there. So that pretty much just sums up what the group does. And lest we forget, University Atheists and Agnostics. This is a UT student organization. Of course, the spring semester is just wrapped up, so they're going to start again in the fall. Of course, no clue as to the meeting times or meeting rooms yet for the fall, but you can go to, I think, UAA at mel.utexas.edu if you're a UT student or faculty member, like Brian, and just get information if you want to be a member or if you just want to meet those folks. First successful UT Atheist and Agnostic student group.
Yeah, and it's a lot of fun. It's basically a social group, but we'll get together and we'll talk about all sorts of interesting subjects. It's a great place to meet people to have intelligent conversations. Mm-hmm. And we have Christians who will come regularly and talk with us and argue with us, but it's all very friendly.
That's good. That's good. You've just got any people in there trying to evangelize to you? And
you
probably have.
A few, but they're mostly pretty nice.
Yeah. Well, when they realize that they're up against people who know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
I've read a lot of. It's not just of course you look at chick tracks, right? I mean, they always conveniently.
It's not that easy.
They always conveniently debate stupid people, right?
Yeah.
And
Jesus, who's he?
Yeah. And this happens like if you read Christian apologetics today too. It's like they always say, no, an atheist will say this. And it's like, well, if he's dumb, he'll say that. But I don't know anybody who would respond that way. And then of course they like to think they can just change your mind and convert you with the simplest little quip that they can throw out. And it's like, oh well. Okay, so anyway, we're going to go right into it here. Just really quickly, if you want to find out more information about ACA, you can visit our website at atheist-community.org. And also, if you are, if this is your first time to watch the show, just to give you a rundown on it, we've been on for several years. This is a live call-in show. We take phone calls from just about anybody who wants to call us and challenge us, believers and unbelievers alike. And we'll put that phone number up in a few minutes. But if this is your first time to watch the show, and you want to call in, you may want to try visiting our website first, because we have a fact page where a lot of the most rudimentary, basic questions are laid out. We've just taken all the most common questions that Christians have for atheists. We put them in a fact list. We put that up on the website. Just basic stuff like, what's the difference between being atheist and agnostic? What do atheists think about this or that or the other thing? So there's that. But if you want to call us up, you can do that during the show. And we also have a viewer email address, and which people seem to be scared to write to. But don't be bashful. We'll go ahead and we won't shout you down. We'll answer whatever questions you have, and that is tv@atheist-community.org. That's viewer email, and of course, if we get good letters, we'll read them out and we'll answer them on the air, and we'll answer anything we get. Anything we get, we'll answer it personally. But if it's a really good question, a very interesting topic, we'll talk about it on the air. And of course, we put that up because we get loads and loads of phone calls every single show, and we never manage to get to everybody. There's always at least 2 people hanging on at the end of the program, even though we were on for 90 minutes. So there's that. tv@atheist-community.org is the reviewer email address. And now it's over to this guy, Ashley Perrien, to see what's happening in the news this week. How about?
Okay. Light news week, actually.
Okay.
First one being the House GOP. They originally had tried to push through, and kind of sort of successfully did push through, the faith-based initiatives. Mm-hmm. That has now been pared down significantly. Right. They abandoned efforts for now to open government programs to religious groups, agreeing to go along with a Senate bill that simply offers tax breaks to encourage charitable giving. House Republicans had hoped to enact a far-reaching version of President Bush's faith-based initiative, but there's not enough support to move it through the Senate. The House is making one key change to the Senate's version of the bill. To attract Democratic support, Senate backers are including a $1.3 billion more over the next 2 years for the Social Services Block Grant, an increase which the White House strongly opposes.
Okay.
So, they're stripping the original bill down. They're dumping something else in it that other people want.
Well, there were too many very real problems with it, right? I mean, first off, it's already legal for churches and religious organizations to form like separate entities for the purposes of doing charitable work.
Yes.
Okay? And those separate entities are able to get, and have been for a long time, government funding, right? And what has been behind the whole push for faith-based initiatives is the idea that it's essentially religious entitlements. It's the idea that, no, let's go ahead and give money directly to churches. And pretend that it doesn't pose any sort of a separation problem. And this will allow churches to get that funding without having to adhere to federal, anti-discrimination laws, for example, in hiring or in who they service, and still be able to get that government funding that every other organization that gets government funding has to adhere to those laws. So that was so clearly unfair. That I think there was really no way that they could spin that into something that was positive.
And as you pointed out, I mean, giving money to a church so that they can open a soup kitchen or something like that may not be the worst thing in the world. It's in the Constitution. It says that government and religion cannot get too far entangled. And that's really where the problem lies. If you're going to have all of a sudden, you're giving money to a church to say you can open a soup kitchen, but that money has to go towards soup kitchen, nothing else. How are you going to monitor that without the government sticking its nose into the entire church business to make sure that the money isn't being funneled around to somewhere else through some strange means?
Which is exactly what the First Amendment is set up to prevent, is this sort of government monitoring of religion.
Exactly. Exactly. So
and then, of course, there is just the hypocrisy of the whole thing. I mean, ask any conservative Christian who likes the idea of faith-based initiatives if they are favorable to the idea of the Scientologists getting tax money.
Exactly. The Satanists.
Or the Wiccans or whoever. And they're going, oh, no, we can't have that. So.
Well, President Bush was against the Nation of Islam getting money. I'm not sure if they can actually stop them from getting money, though.
Again, that just shows that this is a conservative Christian entitlements program is
Exactly.
really all it is, and it's not. Other faiths need not apply.
Yeah. Well, they can apply; they'll just get turned down.
Right. So
That's not a real religion.
Yeah.
So
I know that's the other problem, right? It puts the government in the
Yeah.
position of determining what's a real religion or not, which is what the government's not allowed to do.
exactly.
And has
Can
no
the Wiccans
has no
say that, or
has
can
no
the
right to
government
do.
say that
What
the
right does
Wiccan is
President Bush or whoever the president is, or John Ashcroft?
Yeah.
What right do these people have, just by virtue of being in public office, to declare what's a religion and what isn't? Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Mr. American citizen who lives over here.
Yeah.
Your faith isn't a real faith because it isn't mine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can't do that.
Oh well.
All right.
So they won't.
Good. Okay. Well, that's all settled. Well, let's go home.
That was easy.
Okay.
Okay, next one. This is in Houston.
Okay.
This is a girl who's in school there. I can't really tell if it's college or...
No, isn't this Santa Fe? That's the high school. The high school
yeah,
where they
the
had
high school. Yeah, that's right.
the football flap back in 2000.
Yeah. The girl essentially wanted to be able to give prayers over the loudspeaker.
Well, she did it.
Before the football
Yeah,
game.
that's why there was a big suit.
Well, she wanted to. They said no. She went to court for it, and she got a restraining order. I think it said, what is this? A former student who secured a restraining order so she could pray over a public address system before high school's 1999 home football games. So she went to pray for that. Then other people brought that to court and said you can't be praying over the PA system. Eventually it went to the Supreme Court. Different cases went to the Supreme Court. They said that such prayers are unconstitutional. And so coming back to this case, this one's now kind of thrown out there. Went back to court anyway because they figured damages. What do we do for damages? Well, she did get some, unfortunately. They said that, yes, they had, kind of messed her up a little bit, so they'll pay her legal fees and $1.
Wow.
She was getting $1 in legal fees. She can get herself a decent Coke during lunch sometime, and she can frivolously fritter away her entire settlement award.
Yeah. I think that's the start of the trust fund for all her little homeschooled Christian kids.
Exactly. Start with $1.
Well. It's just I've never figured out why it is there's this compulsion among some people in the religious right. It's like every single public gathering.
Yeah.
Something as innocuous as a high school football game, all these little events have to be turned into religious ceremonies. Like, what is up with that?
Yeah, what we had a week or two ago.
Apart from just public grandstanding, it's showboating. It's look how pious and holy we are, aren't we great?
Well, they had the email a week or two ago from the college student who at the end of his statistics presentation had to say, the only thing that allows me to do any of this is my Savior and Lord Jesus Christ. It's a statistics project.
Yeah.
Get over
What's it got to do? Yeah, this is just a guy who wants everyone to see how pious and holy and Christian he is. There's this egomania, that's involved with the,
He's getting something out of it.
Yeah.
If everybody turns to him and says, "Oh, you idiot, get out of here."
Right.
Well, then he gets to be, that kind of like martyr, who I'm the poor oppressed Christian. And if people go along with it, well, hey, then you got more Christians.
Which brings us over to Brian. Okay. I mean, you're a college student. You're studying religious studies, and so no doubt you probably encounter the religious element among the UT populace, student body and staff, quite a lot. But before we get into amusing encounters you may have had, let's talk about first off what is the religious studies majors in a broad sense, and then specifically what are you interested in? What made you choose that major? Why did you decide to go into that as a career, etc.? Just tell us a little bit about all that.
Well, first of all, I want to say that I am not a representative of the university anyway, so I'm not speaking officially, and my views are not necessarily the views of the university, although I'm going to stay as factual as possible. But the religious studies program is very much misunderstood, and I've encountered it time and again, that people will hear your religious studies, and even professors have this problem with other UT professors. They'll say they're involved with the UT religious studies program, and other professors will think that they're really religious or that they're specifically Christian and endorsing Christianity in some way. But it's a big misunderstanding. I encounter it all the time. But first of all, the religious studies degree, only 30 hours of it are actual religious classes, and out of 120 hours. So that's only about 10 10 classes, which is enough to get a basis in it.
And by religious classes, do you mean like you're learning what a specific religion is, what its tenets and its doctrines are?
Yeah, I'm going to get into that in just a second. But it's a liberal arts degree. It's just like philosophy or history or English. And you can do, with religious studies, basically what you can do with those, which is not a whole lot, really. With just
academia, right? Yeah.
Right. I mean,
is it its own department, or is it part of the philosophy department?
It's a liberal arts. It's part of the whole liberal arts thing, and so it's got its own department. But you can actually get a lot more serious into it, so it can require a lot more study than just. You can sort of float by with those 30 hours, but if you really get involved with it, especially with Christianity or looking at more ancient topics on religions, you really have to study languages. It's like for my field, I've got to know probably 2 languages really well and another one enough to get by on.
Really?
So like Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, really common. Maybe Aramaic, something like that.
Huh.
And they have Latin, Greek, and Hebrew at the university.
Yeah.
They teach that.
But not Aramaic, probably.
I don't think so.
I can't imagine there's a high demand for Aramaic anymore.
Not
unless you want to be in Mel Gibson's new movie.
Right.
True.
So you'll be able to watch that without the subtitles. So,
right.
Yeah, okay. Okay. So fascinating. So you've got to be at least to where you can read it, right? Or be
right.
Yeah.
It depends on how much you do with it.
Sure.
Like I say, you could be liberal arts and basically just sort of float by.
Yeah. See, I would have thought history obviously would have been a big component of it.
Right.
But that would be just, I think, tied into it. But I wasn't aware of the importance that being bilingual.
Language.
It does make sense.
Well, just to
in the end.
Yeah. Because I imagine a lot of that has to do with the fact that you're studying the source material in many ways.
Right.
So you've got to go to those ancient texts.
Exactly.
Okay.
To figure out what they're saying.
So that's interesting. Huh.
What we do in religious studies is we try to understand religions from a historical context.
Okay.
We don't endorse or discourage religiosity or anyone's faith. So we're not saying you should be religious or you shouldn't be religious. And we only study it in an academic, really objective way. There's we will get into theology, of course, and dealing with how people relate to the text and how people believe, but we do that in a very very academic way. So that originally the religious studies programs, and this was true until just a few decades ago actually, were run by churches, by local churches, and they could be really good in terms of being objective, and they could be really bad in terms of being extremely biased.
Yeah.
And same thing with seminaries. You can actually I've considered going to some seminaries before, because some of them are liberal enough, and some of them are really academic and objective. Of course, and a lot of them will teach you things about the Bible that most people don't want to know. Most Christians just don't want to hear that.
Gospel of Thomas? What's that?
Right. Things you should not say in church sermons.
Right. Well, ministers get in trouble for it all the time. They'll go to seminary, they'll come back, they'll try to say something like, there weren't just 3 magi that went to visit Jesus, and we don't really know what number they were.
Yeah.
And just something as innocent as that.
It wasn't an apple. No one knows what it was.
Right, exactly. I mean,
don't say that.
That's enough. But we look at religions, it's interdisciplinary, so we look at it from a variety of different angles.
Okay.
And we look at how they develop and change and interact with people and societies, and how those societies influence it, and sort of how it comes up out of those societies and how it influences them and influences politics and other religions. And so it brings
in a lot then, right? I mean, you got anthropology, sociology, politics.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's very dependent on looking at the context of religion, and not just, what it says and as this thing that's just there by itself in this island off somewhere. It's how it's connected with everything around it.
Sure.
The times.
Yeah, you really get a sense for just how all-encompassing religion is just in the whole history of human endeavor. I mean, it really does stick its nose in absolutely everything.
Yeah.
From politics, just the way entire cultures develop. So it's not as though there's nothing to the claims that you get from some Christians saying that, religion is the source of morals or the source of this or the source of that.
Right.
Simply because in earlier societies, I mean, religions, for one thing, were the governing bodies, were they not?
Right.
So if the governing body's out there making the laws, based upon, well, this is what we think the gods want, then there is a little something to that.
Right. Well, the history of Christianity is basically the history of the Western Western world.
Yeah.
But we don't. There are no actual specific religious studies professors. I don't think there are. Instead we have experts from a large number of different departments. We've got from 13 main departments, and some of those are classics, which study ancient Greece and Rome. We get American studies, a lot of history classes, archaeology, dealing with more ancient stuff and how we know these things, some of these things about history. Anthropology and sociology, dealing with how people relate to religions and how religions will reflect people's needs of the times and things like that. And of course, languages, which brings in some really interesting stuff with the Bible. Okay, that is just it's one of the real fascinating things about the Bible is just trying to figure out what it says. It's so tricky. Asian studies, Middle Eastern studies, philosophy, dealing with the philosophies of different religions and even regular philosophies, because existentialism, for example, I just took a class on that with Dr. Solomon at the university, and I think he's an atheist. Now, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, he's an existentialist, and
and there's not much with that point of view that jives.
Right. I'm pretty sure he's an atheist. I don't want to put him into a box necessarily, but that had a lot of influence on religion, since existentialism had a lot of influence on, especially like American religion. Yeah,
I was going to say, is existentialism largely an American phenomenon, or is it? It pops up in Europe.
Well, yeah, it started in Europe, of course, and so it had a lot of influence over there. Right. But just from what I know about it, it had a lot of influence on American religions specifically. Okay. But.
So it started in Europe along with most everything else we have over here. Right. But the greater influence it had was upon the way American religion.
What I'm saying is that's all I know.
Okay. Well, I mean, more than I do, so that's why I'm asking you these things. Okay. So, all right, interesting. So, what else? I know you have some more details, and I want to get into all of those. But first of all, what would lead an atheist student to take an interest in this? I mean, I know a lot. I think, as an atheist, it's important to understand and comprehend religion, so that you can effectively argue against it and point out why all of the tenets and the doctrines make no sense, or are flawed, or just aren't as good as people think they are, or what have you. A lot of atheists, though, they just kind of want to be left alone, and they want religion to go away, and just want just don't want to hear about Jesus and God and all this other all the rest of it. And so what was it that sort of inspired you to kind of just really get in there and whack the hornet's nest?
Well, the reason the reason I'm studying academically is I want to teach, right? And so this is the reason I like religion, and the reason I'm want to teach religion specifically is that it's something that I find it's extremely important in the world, first of all, and it's important for people to understand religion. The other thing is that it's always fascinated me. It's always been really interesting to me. It's like Christianity and the Bible and early Christianity, and figuring out how it all came together and the pieces and what a specific text means. It's like I think the Bible is man's greatest puzzle, the greatest man-made puzzle. Just trying to figure it out.
That's interesting. Just elaborate on that. I mean, is it just in terms of how complex and how long it took to just the whole process of assembling it, putting it together, what it was for originally? I mean, what the reasons were for
translations.
Well, just for assembling all of these ancient writings in the first place, and then what in the motivations may have changed when it came around to putting the New Testament canon together and how those relate, the New and Old Testaments relate. Right. I mean, it is fascinating to understand, from a cultural standpoint, the development of that.
Right. Well, and so if you take any text. And you sort of have to put it back in its place and time. And so, first of all, you have to figure out what its place and time is. So that's one piece of the puzzle. Sure. Then you have to figure out who's writing it and what their bias is, which can get tricky. And you have to figure out how they wrote it and what pieces they brought together, and if it was all their invention or if they put it together from different sources, which a lot of the Bible is put together from different sources. Sure. And so you have all those elements and figuring out even just what it says. Just the language. That's a lot more complicated than I've ever got into it. But just looking at what the Hebrew or the Greek words mean in particular contexts and trying to figure out what the author was actually meaning to say. Sure. So it's a lot like history. Yeah. It's very, very much like history.
And it's widely different point of view from that you hear from a great many Christian fundamentalists, which is they just seem to. It's the taking of the document on faith as being this infallible document.
Exactly. Yeah.
When I think just clearly one can only arrive at that opinion of the Bible if one hasn't studied it the way you have, from an academic standpoint, and understood the history of it. So talking about religion contextually, like in terms of the society that it represents, what strikes you as being interesting about the way in which Christianity is practiced today in America, like vis-a-vis any sort of other culture in the past, 18th, 17th centuries into the medieval era. I mean, the Dark Ages when the Vatican ran everything, and into like before the year 1000 when you probably know a lot more about what the church was doing at that time, but the average person, it seems like from the early, like from right after the death of Christ up to what we think of as the Middle Ages in Europe and the 1000s on. A lot of people don't really know what the history of the church is around, at least, common people from like the year, say, 400 to 900 or what have you. But what's interesting about the way that Christianity in America today is practiced and how it's evolved from centuries past.
And it really has. I just took a course called Popular Religion in 20th Century America, and this was by a graduate student named Matthew Hedstrom, who's an excellent instructor. And he's really good. And one of the things I really like about him is I have no idea what he believes, and I like professors that they can give you the subject so objectively that you can't figure out their bias.
Yeah.
Because at times I thought he may have
That's doing it responsibly.
Right. Yeah. At times I thought he may have been a Pentecostalist, but I sort of doubt that. But
I think you'd know.
Right. You probably know.
That one's hard to hide.
Yeah.
But we actually, in this class, we look at how religions were influenced by culture and by what was going on, and they pretty much just reflect it. And of course, they also influence culture, and so there's a
feedback loop.
There's a feedback loop going on there. One of the things that I find really fascinating is that religion has, conservative Christianity in particular, I'm thinking of fundamentalists and creationists, have taken basically science and have taken modernism and have tried to use it to prove themselves true. Just like looking for scientific evidence of Noah's Ark, the whole flood thing. And my philosophy professor, Dr. Solomon, who did the existentialist class, he pointed out that it was really it's fascinating that they feel like they have to do that because they never really bothered with that before. They didn't know how to prove it.
I mean, in the before science, before the age of reason, what we call that period of history, when naturalism, and that point of view began to take hold. I imagine it was just not questioned. No one saw a reason to question it.
Right.
It just the very idea of even investigating and looking into the sources of these beliefs just didn't even occur to anyone. And then, it's definitely a recent phenomenon. It's sort of in the post-scientific age. This whole idea that what I've always found about, especially creationists, is the idea that on the one hand they seem to deplore science because it's this big party pooper that showed up and is debunking all their beliefs left, right, and center. And yet at the same time they recognize in science that it's this agent of prestige and credibility. And so on the one hand, it's like, well, we hate it, but we've got to kind of, find some way to, use its methods and shoehorn our beliefs in there and try to validate our beliefs because that's going to be the way that we convert the unbeliever now. You can't just, go up to somebody who has a scientific education and tell them to take stuff on faith because that's the virtuous thing to do.
Right.
I mean, that person's going to demand evidence. And so this whole phenomenon of, religions feeling like they have to present actual evidence for their beliefs is probably pretty recent, like within the last 200-300 years, no more than, right?
Right, and a lot of religions still don't feel that need.
Yeah.
Like Buddhism, for example, doesn't much care about that at all. Of course, they never cared about converts as much as Christianity, so...
Yeah. Well, then, but Buddhism and a lot of the Eastern religions, they don't, well, some of them do, but many of them don't make that many claims that have to do, that are that seem like they're empirical in nature. They don't make claims about this is how reality works. It does this, that, and the other. And so you have to believe these things.
Right. Well,
there's no motive of saying you have to believe this stuff.
Right.
In our belief system, as in contrast with conservative Christianity or any kind of Christianity, which is like, here's the doctrines, and you got to believe all this stuff to be saved.
Right. And that's one of the things that I'm very much interested in is why are the Eastern religions inclusive in saying you could go to look at, if you're a Buddhist, you can go to a Hindu temple. And why is that okay there, but it's not okay over here? And I think part of the reason is just monotheism. It's just the way it's developed in the West. It's not just belief in one God, but it's very much linked up with a whole Western sort of almost rationalistic mindset, not in the scientific sense, but there's this really strong emphasis on this is, proving these things true, like Islam, Christianity. You read the Gospels, and a lot of it is clearly very, very much just propaganda for the Christian faith. I mean, and so you look at the Buddhist texts though, and they don't have nearly as much of that sort of thing. So they didn't have the need to prove that.
Well, do you think that a lot of it may have to do with the fact that Western religion is more linked with politics than Eastern religion is, or is that not the case?
Well,
because it seems to me, when you have, it would seem to me that if you had a religion that was tied into a culture's political structure, then the whole idea of conversion to that religion becomes a very important thing to concentrate on.
Right.
In terms of getting the masses to stay in line.
Right.
Whereas if you just have a belief system like Buddhism, which is all just sort of Zen and find inner peace and what have you, and it's a much different sort of there's not that push to you got to win over the infidel.
Right. Well, there definitely isn't as much of a push. The Eastern religions do get involved with politics quite a bit, and of course, a lot of the Eastern countries will have theocratic governments even to this day.
Yeah.
But I think you got a good point with the getting involved with politics. If you look at ancient Rome, which Christianity grew out of that, you had Roman emperors, and they declared themselves to be gods, which is, by the way, something I think that influenced the whole Christian idea of Jesus' divinity, which is sort of a thesis I've been working on.
Okay. But there were messianic belief systems also in play. I mean, prior to Jesus, right?
Right.
I mean, there was. We talk about Mithra a lot, but I'm sure there were others that we don't know about.
There were quite a few.
But that's interesting to think the whole notion of deifying emperors. I've read some history on that, and I know that, for example, stories of miracles or miraculous happenings were quite often attributed to emperors in Rome. Like by their troops. You'd have, that would be like a morale booster among the troops. They would talk about how, Augustus rode into battle and an eagle swooped down, from the skies bearing a glowing golden sword or something and gave it to him, and he vanquished the Germanian, peasant scum, and that was great. And this was circulated around, the rank and file of the centurions. And I don't know how many of them actually believed it, but it certainly was, these stories were being told. And it struck me that these were very similar to the stories of miracles attributed to Christ.
Right.
With the raising the dead and the healing the blind and the lepers and what have you. And so I can see where there would be a similarity in those sorts of, people's responses to things and how they feed off these, and they just encourage the belief system. I guess it would be, personal reasons, whether it had to do with, political loyalties or just sort of your morale, just who you are in the society that you live in, right?
Right. But you look at ancient Rome. Their gods were it was a civil religion basically, and sacrificing to the gods was sort of like saying, "Hey, I believe in this government. I obey this government." Sacrificing to the emperors. It's pretty clear that saying that the emperor is divine and believing he's a god, that's a really strong statement for his political power and for his,
it's hard to run against God.
Yeah, let's hope George W. Bush doesn't twig to that.
Right.
But,
and so and I haven't actually taken that many classes on ancient Christianity or Rome. And I actually to the point where I'm going to start taking a lot more of those, and so getting in more into languages and such. But that's something I've been really very much interested in is how did these early Christian beliefs start off?
Yeah.
And I don't think initially Jesus was actually thought of as a divine person. He was the Messiah, right? But if you look at the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's very little in there that is explicitly about Jesus being divine. It's mostly him as the Messiah. He's God's chosen one. And later on, see, what I think happened in early Christianity is you had a bunch of close followers of Jesus. I mean, you read them. If you read the Gospels, and there's a lot of debate about how historical they are and how much they can be trusted, but the followers were extremely devoted to Jesus. I mean, he had a very tight-knit community. He was a very charismatic leader. When he died, his followers were basically left with his community, his teachings. You know, he was partially a social reformer, a political and religious reformer, and they wanted to continue that. And I think early on, a lot of the talk of Jesus being a Messiah, of ascending up to heaven, which has links again to the Roman emperors who also ascended to Mount Olympus, and so that put them in a position of authority as well. And people would sacrifice to them and ask for favors.
Right.
I think a lot of it early on was political and religious rhetoric to emphasize their leader, to give themselves divine authority and to give their leader divine authority.
Okay.
And I don't think it even necessarily involved, hallucinations. There may have been hallucinations somewhat involved with that, or urban legends, or just people making up even legends, or just believing these supernatural things. I think a lot of it was just political and religious rhetoric. Because you look at the Roman emperors, a lot of educated people called them gods, but they didn't believe it. It was just statements. They were rhetorical statements. They were statements to put a lot of emphasis on it. But how many educated people actually thought they were gods?
Yeah. So then are you suggesting that even a lot of the early, maybe not the early Christian writers, but at the very least his disciples, or the people who were Jesus' contemporaries, may well have just called him divine or a god, or God in the flesh or what have you, but not thought of that in the way that, for example, Pat Robertson might think of that. To them, it was a statement of, this guy has the highest, to us, political authority that any individual can have. Is that kind of what you mean?
A big part of Jesus' ministry was talking about the kingdom of God. He had spiritualized it, whereas a lot of the other messianic hopefuls at the time, there were quite a few running around, talked about it in terms of political action, in terms of military action and defeating Rome militarily.
Okay.
Well,
that was what a lot of the Old Testament prophets were talking about when, I've been reading some Christian apologetics lately and working on refutation, and I'm looking at, they say, well, this New Testament passage was clearly, is reflecting this Old Testament passage, which is you go back, you read the Old Testament prophecy, and what this Old Testament prophecy is actually talking about, somebody who wasn't Jesus at all. It's this big warlord who would, grab his spear and his sword and rally all of the peoples together, and they would vanquish the foes, and it was this big, violent thing. It was this purging of everybody who wasn't on God's side.
Right, and the Old Testament in general is very, I want to say materialistic, in the sense that it's very earthly. It was very much, salvation in the Old Testament isn't an eternal one. It's based on the here and now. It's based on a good life lived and having your kids go on and continue. The New Testament, I think a lot of the changes in the New Testament, of course, you have a bunch of historical changes that will come in, such as heaven and hell being introduced between the periods of the Old and New Testament. In the New Testament, I think Jesus is messianic. He's established sort of the idea of a spiritual kingdom of God already. And the other messianic hopefuls who would say, we're going to go beat Rome, they get themselves killed off. And you'll hear apologetics sometimes of, well, what about all these other messiahs that when they were going to do this, but then they get themselves killed off and then their followers stop. Well, why didn't Jesus' followers stop? Because he was God, right? But
because they were smart enough not to try and storm Rome.
Right, exactly. And
12 guys.
when those other messiahs died,
couple of turns on the wall. Who the hell is it?
Right. Bing. Well,
So anyway,
there goes the Christians.
Well, when the other messiahs died, of course, their movements had to die because that was all they were offering. But Jesus was offering sort of this spiritual kingdom type deal.
Forever.
And so when he died,
and
I'm not even saying that the followers were necessarily disingenuous in thinking that he had been ascended. And a lot of scholars think originally the stories about Jesus' resurrection were dealing with more of a spiritual than a material thing. And it's sort of like they had visions of him, sort of like Paul had a vision. Well, he didn't even see Jesus, he just heard his voice of him up in the clouds on the right side of God. So it's sort of like this sense that Jesus is in control, like this charismatic figure has been upheld by God.
So the the resurrection was then perhaps originally intended as a metaphorical tale, not something that was meant to say this really happened in physically, but this is this was the representation through the writings of the gospel writers to say, look, Jesus survived his persecution by the Pharisees, and now he's at God's right hand, and he's still in charge, even though he's dead. Yeah, don't worry, he's still around. That's kind of was a.
Yeah, and of course it's very difficult to say how much they believe because it's 2,000 years ago, and our sources there are no real secular sources from anywhere near that period. They're all extremely biased Christian sources that are written to prove Christianity is true, and they weren't. You have to understand how they were written and how they were brought together and those elements. So that's
that's interesting.
That's what we look at.
I'll throw the phone number up on the screen right now. But what would you say then, just while we're waiting for calls to rack up, I know that being part of UAA, and you go to the meetings, so you get a lot of Christians who come in, and they want to challenge you and debate with you or something. And when you reveal some of this information to them, I mean, have you had an opportunity to do that? Are they surprised? Are they like, oh, no?
Well,
what are the things that you find that people who are actual Christians don't know about their faith and the history, and especially the history of their faith, that you think they ought to know? What would be, if you only knew this,
Just one thing?
We're only on for 90 minutes today. So it's like,
Well, I would want them to look at it historically and to look at it in context and to study what scholars actually say about it. Really, I don't know. I would like them to look at the Bible and to put it in context and not to take it literally, but to see what the writers were getting at. And just for Christians, if you're looking at the Bible and you want to understand it, you have to go back, you have to look at its history, you have to look at what's going on in that period, you have to look at the other writings that surround it, and even other religious writings, because they will relate with other religious writings in a number of ways, and try to understand what the point that these people are trying to get across is. Because it's not just supernatural metaphysics. So the Bible really isn't just supernatural metaphysics. It's very much about political and social reform. And of course, all that stuff gets messed up with the metaphysics and all that. But you look at the Gospels, there's a bunch of stuff about the poor, about the oppressed, about nonviolence. There's so much more there than just these literal spiritual things. And that's really what I find really fascinating. Is just this whole,
which would make sense from a historical context if you're talking about like these writings are emerging from people who are subjects of the Roman Empire, okay, a vast and very cruel empire.
Exactly.
Don't really have that many rights under the law, right? I mean, your average Judean wasn't a Roman, so that's, so that was a very real problem for them. And of course, and certainly the persecutions of Christians could have only helped, really, in the long run. This whole sense that, we must really be onto something if, they're setting us all on fire.
Right, and I think the very idea of a Messiah who has been crucified, who's been oppressed and persecuted, would appeal to a lot of these poor people. And we know historically at the very earliest.
Yeah, you can identify with that. You identify with someone who's being beat up on by the.
Right. So the very early Christianity was mostly made up of the poor, oppressed, and it's clear from reading the writings that that's exactly what they're talking about. Like the Epistle of James is saying that. It says in some parts that God has selected the poor to be saved, and he speaks out against the rich. He says, aren't the rich the very people who have been oppressing you? So why are you showing them favor? And so I think that for people who had been oppressed, that the idea of a crucified Messiah would be something that would really speak to them. And so I think it's a pretty noble thing if you look at it that way. You have these poor people who really don't have much hope. I mean, it's sort of sad that this is the hope that they have.
Yeah.
Right?
But then, of course, when you're talking about an early culture like that, a primitive culture where this was at a time when such concepts as human rights and civil liberties weren't discussed the way they are today. And so that's interesting that you point that out, because what I'd like to do is the next thing I'd like to touch on is, since if that was the original intent of what a lot of the New Testament writers were after, then how then has Christianity changed from that into what we've got today in America? And do you think that the figures back, the people back then, 1900 years ago, would be boggled to see that the Christian faith was still thriving, 2,000 years later, and yet serving an entirely different sort of political purpose?
I think they would be scared of cars.
Well, yeah.
I mean, they wouldn't understand Christianity today. Early Christianity was not like it is now.
Right.
Like I said, just can I get through my academics thing real fast?
Well, let's go and tell you what. Let's see what Dave has to say on line 1, and then we'll do that after him. Okay.
Okay.
So just boom. Hi, you're on the air.
Hey, hi guys. I'm Dave. Brian.
Yes.
A few years ago, I read the 5 Gospels. Do you know this book?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sure you do know this book. You might even have made this point already, and I just missed it. But somewhere in that book, it states that the Mark, Peter, John, Luke, whatever, the New Testament writers are not the actual apostle Mark, John, Peter. You know what I mean?
Right.
Is this? Could you clarify that for me? I just forget what that book says, basically.
Okay. Well, the Epistle of Paul. Some of the epistles of Paul were written by Paul. Some others are written in his name, which was an accepted practice at the time, actually. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, there's no really good evidence that they were written by the disciples themselves. And there's some pretty good evidence against that idea. For example, Matthew uses a huge percentage of Mark in his writing. If Matthew had been and Mark was supposedly someone who had taken dictation from Peter, one of the disciples, but all those names were ascribed early on in church tradition. The Gospel of Matthew, though, like I said, it uses a bunch of Marks. So why would someone who's an eyewitness take these writings and add them into theirs?
Yeah.
See, and the way I understood it, and again, I'm sort of forgetting what I read, but a lot of the things were there was evidence that they were written a lot longer after these guys would have been dead and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
They were pieced together probably over a period of time.
Right.
Whoever the author of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John was didn't just sit down and over a period of a month just write the whole book out, right? It was like a modern day writer. It was gathering information and probably being changed and revised and edited as the belief system sort of began to firm up in, the latter part of the first century, right?
Right. So that's something in religious studies that we would study is how did these things come together? And a lot of it was just oral tradition that was brought together. Some of it was original inventions by the people who wrote it. There's Mark, and then you have Matthew and Luke, which both use a source that's commonly called Q, which is German for Quell, which means source in German. And just looking at the strands, it looks like they've both taken something from a document and they've sort of changed it to fit what they're saying. For example, Luke is more. Is it Luke? I think Luke is more interested in the literal poor, in terms he's more interested in economics, so he'll change things around for that.
Let me just a real quick follow up, and then I'll get off here. So then this person or group of people would then just paste on the name Matthew or whatever?
Well, it developed through early church tradition, and we're not entirely sure about how each of the names got attributed, but they're fairly early, but there's really no good evidence for it.
But you're saying it was an accepted practice at that time
Yeah, it could be.
To ascribe the name of someone else to your writings, I guess, for what?
Reverse plagiarism.
Well, not necessarily that. Would it be that if you thought, for example, if you were somebody who agreed with the points of view of a particular individual, you might identify with that individual if you were trying to write something that elaborated on his work, and then you might put his name to it? Are you saying that wasn't uncommon back then?
Just like speaking in his voice. Like some of the epistles of Paul were written in his voice, sort of in his style, but not close enough. Greek scholars will look at it and they'll be able to tell it wasn't written by Paul. But a lot of people would have understood when they got that these were not actual letters written by Paul. Of course, that's a controversial point because it's incredibly difficult to prove that.
Yeah, you can't really. But was that something that might have developed from the early Greek philosophers writing dialogues?
Well,
you play two characters and then you talk like they're talking. Well, and that's how you get your ideas across.
Right, but also that's a good point. Also from the Old Testament, we have some of the Psalms are attributed to David, for example, and they're fairly late in their language. The same thing with Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon, which were supposedly written by Solomon, but are far too late in their language to have been written by Solomon. But people who had read this for the first time probably would not have looked at this and said, "Oh, Solomon wrote this." They would have thought, "Well, this is poetic. You know, it's literary. You know, it's a..."
And it's meant to evoke what Solomon represents.
Right, exactly.
Okay. Interesting. So it'd be like today if someone were some political, disciple of, some early American figure like Jefferson, right, who would write this long, treatise of Jeffersonian politics and then sign it or put Thomas Jefferson's name just right at the top.
I've seen those today, like people writing in George Washington's name and,
Huh. That's interesting. Okay.
Martin, you guys, if you haven't read the 5 Gospels, you should.
Yeah, we'd like to.
Read.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. Go ahead and give an author on that.
You know what? It's actually.
Do you know?
Well,
I don't have my copy handy. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Oh, yes, I do. It's called The 5 Gospels, What Did Jesus Really Say? Robert Funk, Roy Hoover, and the Jesus Seminar.
Okay. That's all right. So, interesting. Yeah, I've started picking up some, just like historical books about like I've been reading the Bible Unearthed by Finkelstein, and so I've been going through that, and then I'm been very interested in reading more books of that nature. So yeah, we appreciate that. Anything else?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for your call.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, now what you were going to get into before we talk to Dave. Let's talk a little bit about that. And there's the phone lines. Throw them open. Ask Brian a question, and we'll see.
Just real quick, just dealing with the religious studies again. Your religious studies students, of course, study a whole bunch of different religions. So we study a whole variety of them. And we have 4 areas you specialize in as a major. And one of them is, the first one is religions of Asia, which is stuff like Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, that sort of thing. Second area is religions of the Middle East, the Mediterranean, Europe. That would be stuff like Christianity, Judaism, Islam. And that's my area of expertise, of course. Area 3 is the Americas, religions of the Americas. So you study things, religion as it develops in America, and
strictly, West European and religions. Would that include things like Christianity and Judaism that came here, or
that
would it be
include
Native American religions?
That would include everything, I think.
Oh, so everything. So Native American religions as well as
I think I may be wrong about that because. But you would study Native American religion.
Because it seems to me that a lot of the Native American religions are dead or as good as dead now. I mean, they've pretty much all been subsumed. I mean, certainly nobody's worshiping the Aztec or Incan gods anymore.
Right.
But unlike you get in the East and you get in Europe and like the Mideast religions, those have survived and sort of morphed into something else today. You don't really see, unless I don't know about it. You don't see. I'm sure that there are Native American tribes, little groups of a populace that still hold on to their own religious traditions, but there's really, in sense of influencing culture at large, they don't.
Right. Which brings us to area 4, which is religions of Africa, tribal religions, and approaches to the study of religion. And so tribal religions would cover that, like really primitive type religions. And you see a lot of very associated religions in some parts of India and in Africa. The department is small. We've only got last I heard it was 80 students. I've heard 60 to 80 students, maybe a few more. I think we've only had like 10 people graduate.
Is this a new?
Yeah, it's very new. This is this is the first religious studies program of any sort in a public university in Texas.
Really?
Yeah.
They have them also in the country, or?
Yeah, in other parts of the country. But this is the only one in a public university. Private universities will have religious classes.
And certainly you would imagine that any like a parochial or religious.
Right.
No, you don't get religious studies in Bob Jones. You get this.
Right.
That's what you get at Bob Jones University.
You get a type of religious studies.
Yeah.
I've met all sorts of religious studies students. I've met a couple of atheists, liberal Christians, very liberal Christians, of course. I've even met a few conservative Christians, although seminary will mostly sap those away because those people aren't really interested as much in studying other religions. And there are some that are. There are some conservative Christians who are actually pretty open-minded about this, and study it academically, and they can still. They have to deal with the facts, of course.
Yeah.
But they can still hold on to a pretty strong conservative faith. I've even met a few Buddhists, a few Hindus. In terms of the professors, I don't know a whole lot of them personally. Of the professors I've had, one was an atheist, one was a Buddhist, One was a Hindu Vedantist, a couple I wasn't sure of, and one was a very liberal Quaker Christian. And
we had that guy who spoke at our church-state separation rally. We had a Quaker speak at that.
Right.
Great guy.
Yeah, I heard it was excellent.
Yeah. Now, this was something that I did want to ask you about, and you touched on it, but just maybe in a little more detail. I'm waiting for the next call. Why? What the character of the kinds of students who study this? I mean, now it does seem to me that this is religious studies as this major is has been put together. It just seems to be like, okay, let's take comparative religion to the nth degree and really get into it deeply. But do you find that most of the students probably are religious more so than atheists, or just as they are in the general population? But do you find that, again, the character of this, you don't get the holy rollers in there. You get the people who aren't quite, as willing to just blindly accept the dogmas that they get. They want to sort of get the big picture.
Right.
But do you think that, do you find that there's many times what motivates them is that they think that by studying these things they'll come to a deeper faith or a deeper belief, or do you get some of them that really want to challenge themselves? They say, do you get that much? You talked about how some of them are very liberal. Do you get any who are that liberal saying, all right, I've been told that Jesus is Lord all my life and I believe it, but maybe I'm wrong. Let me study this. And do you get those students who aren't atheists, obviously? I mean,
I'll tell you the truth. I don't actually know that many religious studies students because there aren't that many.
I just thought you might have had an opportunity to just scope a few of them out. And
certainly, I think all those things are true. Some of the students I met have been testing themselves, have been trying to strengthen their faith, have been interested in other faiths. But of course, they're going to have to be open-minded because you look at the professors. Like we have. Some of my professors have pointed out Bible contradictions, for example, in the middle of class, and one of them pointed out a contradiction between Matthew and Luke, and he said, "You either look at the Bible and accept it's errant, or you stop thinking." Right? This is in the middle of class. Right?
Now, at Bob Jones University, that clears the room. That gets a professor fired. Okay,
yeah.
So,
Exactly.
And do the Christian students kind of squirm when they hear that, or is that? I mean, you don't.
Yeah.
Because that is a big part. I mean, so a lot of the Christian apologetics that I've been reading, they are rooted in this premise, which is that, okay, first of all, the Bible is the most perfect thing there is. Okay, so we're going to start there.
Contort themselves into pretzels to explain away absolutely anything.
Yeah,
right.
So we're going to start from that premise and then work out from that premise.
Yeah.
And
and anything that gets in our way, we'll find a way to walk around.
And realistically, you can't really do that. Okay? I mean,
right.
Especially when you realize that this is a collection of books cobbled together over millennia of time. And
just in terms of what we study, we tend to study just one religion at a time. We don't have as much comparative religion. That's sometimes we'll come in with a specific class. But if we're studying like Christianity, we'll just be looking at that. And its context, of course, you'll have to study it in relation to other things. But
all right, well, let's see what Vick has to say. It's on line 1-477-2288. That's our number. Hey, you're on the air.
Yeah, I'm on.
Hey.
How you doing?
We're good.
Hey, we just got back home today, so we're working on loading up pictures from the Jamaican vacation. So anyway, I turned on the TV and guess who was on?
Well, he just can't get rid of us.
I haven't met Brian before. I guess you miss a couple of episodes of, or a couple of times at the bagel shop, and all new faces show up. How you doing, Brian?
Hello.
I thought it was interesting what he said, though, that religion is a kind of a fascinating thing in itself. I don't know if I'd go so far as to join a seminary or something like that, but yeah, it is a pretty fascinating subject. I had a question 5 seconds ago, and it's gone now.
No,
I had my Rastafarian conversion, so
Okay.
I went to see Bob Marley's mausoleum, and I went to the Bob Marley mausoleum. Get my meaning? Anyway.
I think you might need to go back to the Bob Marley mausoleum.
Oh, I'm
and then you
so
might
anxious
remember
to go
your
back.
question. Yeah.
Yes, I'm so anxious. I'll just get back on the plane and go back there and stay. Well, not necessarily at the mausoleum, but Jamaica was really cool.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah. Anyway, just thought I'd call and say hi. And
okay.
As soon as I get an address, I'll put it on the list where you can go look at the pictures.
Okay. Vick, by the way, is one of our long-standing members. He was on the nonprofits for a little while, was co-chair last year. And
are you going to be back on the nonprofits, or do you?
I am. I when y'all started it up while I was on vacation, man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, yesterday.
Nonprofits, Jamaica. You figure it out.
Okay. Yeah. No. So, all right. Well, if you remember that question, call us back.
I'll call you back if I can think of it.
Okay.
Later on, man.
Okay.
Thanks, Colin.
All right. Well, Vick is his usual highly organized self. All right. Well, Steve will probably still know his question, so we'll talk to him. Hey, you're on the air.
Hi there. I do remember my question, in fact.
Good.
This is a very interesting discussion you're having about the just the history of everything in the belief system. And it makes me think, like when I was a kid, one of the first things that sort of, I guess it was early skepticism when I was a little kid, just the whole thing about the New Testament and the Old Testament. And I remember asking my mom, I don't know how old I was, it's like, well, the New Testament, that must have just happened. And then, it's 2,000 years old. And I'm going like, gee, this is really suspicious that they, you got an old thing and then there's a new one. And I don't know, I just thought that was one of the little grains of like, gee, what's going on with this thing? They're changing their mind, a couple thousand years ago. And
that this eternal, unchanging God is changing his mind about lots of stuff.
I never studied it very much, but you said something about that made me want to ask a question, which was sort of the dating of these things. I kind of know that the New Testament stories are supposed to be happening at the time of Christ 2,000 years ago. Then there's the Old Testament, there's everything before that. But I mean, like the end of the New Testament is not like, what happened a week before the New Testament started, like in a book. And what is the latest epic or period that is actually depicted in the Old Testament? And sort of like, how long in terms of history is there a gap between the Old Testament and...
You mean the latest in terms of the actual chronology of events, or the latest actual writings that we have good dates for?
Yeah, I mean, I've never known that, and...
I mean, does it all sort of stop at, the year 33, or, there's...
Oh, okay, well, for the Old Testament?
Well, I guess both.
Well, for both. Okay, well, the Old Testament, it depends on who you're asking. Of course, liberal academic religious studies professors will say that the latest book written was probably Daniel, written around the year 177 BC, and it includes it has some version of a reward in the afterlife, which is something that was lacking before that period, and they sort of had adopted that from the Greeks and from the Zoroastrians. So the earliest one is like 177 BC. That's before Jesus was born, about that time.
So that's pretty close.
Well, yeah.
170 years.
Some of it dates. Most of it dates back further than that. Most of it dates back to at least 400 BC.
Yeah, I read, according to the Bible Unearthed, those authors were claiming that many of, at least the Pentateuch, the Torah, I guess, it could be pinpointed to around the 7th century BCE.
Yeah.
And more or less, those 5 books were they were assembled fairly closely to one another. In terms of, it wasn't a thing where, they were spread out over 800 years, and then you finally got the Torah and the Pentateuch. It was, these were oral traditions that had been floating around for some time, but they were set down at that time, and there was definitely, as you mentioned, a political purpose in mind, which was to sort of unite these Israelites, give these people a cultural identity.
Right.
And again, I don't know if this jives with anything that you've been taught and you've been studying, but again, according to the Bible Unearthed, he said that in these cultures, you tend to see these kinds of, let's call them national myths. You see them develop at a particular point in the development of this culture, this civilization, and it is at the time when, okay, now we've got all our sort of people geographically centered, but we need some sort of organization. We need, and more than that, we need an identity. We need a thing that sort of gives us an identity, not just as individuals, but we're the Israelites, or we're the Ammonites, or we're whoever we are.
Right.
And this makes us all feel special, gives us this morale and this feeling of being good for being the Jews or the whoever's. And that's when you tend to see these national myths all coalesce and actually get set down in some sort of concrete form.
And that's
Is this what you're,
Yeah, that pretty much fits.
Yeah.
The Bible on Earth is a good book.
Yeah.
I like that book.
There was another thing you mentioned, something about the conceptually when the introduction of the idea of heaven and hell started to be emphasized, I guess. Mm-hmm. And again, it's sort of interesting that we see something evolving, sort of like the human culture is evolving, as opposed to something that's unchanging. And I think it's very interesting and kind of intuitively reasonable to think that there's a human handprint on the whole thing a lot more than anything else going on. But I'll hang up and let you talk about heaven and hell. But like, could you talk about when heaven and hell sort of crept into the conceptual framework? And I'm just going to go ahead and hang up.
All right. Well, thanks for your call, Steve. Very interesting. Good questions.
Well, it's sort of a complicated issue because, of course, it's really old and we don't have a lot of good documents for it, and there weren't religious studies scholars studying how these elements were coming together at the time. But by the 1st century BC, at least, you had some ideas in at least some parts of Judaism that there would be a literal heaven and hell. And they had influences, of course, from the Greeks who had Hades, and they had that sort of thing, from these pagan ideas, but also from Zoroastrianism, which was the first really monotheistic religion in the world. And there's debate about how monotheistic the Jews really were before the Babylonian captivity around 560 BC, somewhere around there.
Yeah, I've heard from several different sources that the earliest forms of Judaism that we can trace were polytheistic.
Right.
Well, they might have been polytheistic.
They clearly were, and even the Bible sort of portrays the early Israelites.
Like Eve, I think, was originally some sort of fertility goddess.
Right, and
Yahweh was the big storm god who.
Well, you get a lot of controversy dealing with really old stuff and trying to figure out how those things came together. But so you get a lot of that.
And so, but this whole idea, though, of the afterlife as reward or punishment. That's sort of, there's a Greek and Roman tradition there. I mean, everybody went to hell in Greece and Rome, but there were the nice neighborhoods of hell,
right,
that the good people lived in,
the slums.
Okay, and then you had poor guys like Sisyphus or somebody who was a bad boy, and so he had to do all sorts of stupid, pointless stuff forever, and so he was punished. Is that so? So that's not really a thing that's unique unto Christian faith as it emerged.
Oh no.
But do you find that? But I don't know. I mean, like I say, you know more about the history than I do. I don't know that the Greeks or the Romans used. You don't want to end up in the bad neighborhoods of Hades. They didn't use that as any sort of conversion tool to like scare people into the pews, right? I mean,
no.
Do you see that being a thing that is the unique contribution of Christianity to theology? Is this whole idea of the reason you should join our religion is because you'll be tortured forever if you don't. Well, I mean, at what stage did that sort of become a big,
Zoroastrianism.
Really?
Yeah,
okay.
It was there in Zoroastrianism. And there was, according to Zoroastrianism, now I haven't studied it really extensively, but they had an idea of this final judgment, which is where the idea of this final judgment came in. At the end of time, God would intervene in history and he would judge everybody by their actions. If a person's good deeds outweighed their bad deeds, they had like this path they have to walk along over this lake of fire, I think, something like that. And the more good deeds they had, the wider the bridge would be, the easier it would be the cross, and the more bad deeds would be.
Interesting.
So if they had more bad deeds than good deeds, it would shrink down to nothing, and they would just fall off.
Wow, that's interesting.
But the Greeks used it more as, from what I understand, as morality issues, not so much dealing with afterlife and things like that, because they didn't really have a salvation religion in that sense.
Sure.
But the Jews developed it. The Jews had it developed before Jesus came along.
Okay.
So Christianity didn't really create that, although the Jews pretty much dropped that pretty soon after Christianity did it. Maybe partly in response to Christianity.
Yeah, they had us look like, ooh, this really is kind of an unpleasant thing that we don't want to be part of.
Right.
But well, that's interesting. But it seems like what you're describing, though, is that, like you said, it's all like the deeds in life. So Zoroastrianism was more or less the salvation by works philosophy, which is just the more good deeds you do in life. Okay?
Yeah.
And nowadays, what you hear with conservative Christianity is this repudiation of salvation by works, and it's all just pure salvation by faith. So it's and it's how when did? Do you have a clue as to when that sort of it became a thing? And why would it have? I mean, is it just now? It's just more important that we have members of the club than that they're all strictly being good people all the time. Was it a byproduct of, well, it's unrealistic to expect people to engage in perfectly saintly behavior all the time? So maybe we just need to say, look, all you have to do is believe in Jesus and accept him and be as godly as you can.
Well, I'm sure that the pragmatic aspect of it had a lot to do with that. But it's a really complicated issue. Basically, with the Protestants, what happened was they went away from the Catholics, and the Catholics had too much emphasis on works.
Okay.
Right. They just had way too much emphasis. I mean, they were buying. Yeah, they were selling. I mean, they were getting
indulgences.
Indulgences. They got out for money, and so it had gone too far. The Protestants basically went too far on the other extreme. I mean, just looking at it in terms of if the Bible was true and people are supposed to be doing what it says, the Protestants clearly there's a very strong work element there, very strong element. And I know some. Some a Presbyterian minister I know who talks about how works are essential for salvation. Of course, faith is the foremost thing, but also works will be involved with that. And so, it's basically part of it was just ease, part of it was just reacting to the Catholics, right? So
So again, it's just all how the feedback loop, the political situation, the social situation influences how the religion changes and evolves and adapts, and then and then you get this whole new set of teachings.
Exactly.
And religious leaders saying, "Well, it's always been this way." But
right.
So who's first now on the phone? Would it be Lane? It would be Lane. Hi, thanks for holding. You're on the air.
Yes, I had a twofold question. I've been researching, religion for quite some time, just because I'm undecided. There's not really anything tangible you can kind of really point to immediately in your environment to say, "Oh, okay, well, this is what you're supposed to do." Recently, I ran into some documents on the internet that had indicated that the Old Testament refers to Yahweh exclusively, and then the New Testament refers to Jehovah, and that these were actually two different, entities, and that Yahweh created a race of man, and he was, hellfire and brimstone, and then in the New Testament is a little bit more soft, in that Jehovah came down, and things are a little bit more peaceful. And I was just curious if Brian or anybody else had any comments on that. And I just had one other question if I had time.
Okay. Well, let's get your second question, and then we'll hit them both at the same time.
Along with all of this, I guess in the same group of information I ran into, they were basically saying that, Christ, or, the Christ spirit or whatever, he created man, but he created not all of man, he created a race of men. And that there's multiple threads of this coming down with Athena, and your goddess type, theologies and whatnot. And then you have, these godlike beings creating these races, through DNA and all that stuff. And I was just curious if any of y'all hadn't done any research on that, and what your findings were, or if this is just something that you haven't even heard before. It was new to me. That's why I'm asking.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll touch on both those. Thanks a lot for your questions.
Thank you.
Okay. Dealing with the second one first, I'm not entirely sure exactly what he's talking about.
Sounds a lot like what Rail in the Raelians.
Yeah, it sounds like the Raelians. I mean, there's a lot of strange stuff that goes around. But
wouldn't that be an interesting example, though, of how a religion is trying to wrap itself around modern science?
Yeah.
Oh, well, Raelians, it was the alien Elohim doing DNA experiments on chimps. And here we are. I mean, we've
things got a little bit out of control.
So would that more or less be like clearly if you're looking at a belief system that is going to mention modern scientific, findings and theories, that's a modern phenomenon. Clearly.
Yes, very modern. Okay, so dealing with Yahweh, Old Testament, we don't actually know how his name was pronounced. It's traditionally Yahweh. Jehovah is a mispronunciation of Yahweh that the Germans introduced into the language. So he definitely was not called Jehovah. Jehovah is basically a German way of saying Yahweh. I think what he's referring to is the difference between God in the Old and the New Testament. And they're definitely, it depends on what parts of the Old Testament, what parts of the New Testament you're looking at, because certainly God can be very vengeful in both. Extremely vengeful, but he can also be very compassionate towards the poor and towards the oppressed as well. So I think it's, if you're looking at it from, is this true based on that? It's an open question as to whether God could, and as to there are other issues, of course, I think that the Old and New Testament conflict more strongly on. And then that's why you have to, I would encourage Christians to study what the Jews say about the Old Testament and see how the Jews interpret messianic prophecies, for example. And I found that they make a lot more sense than Christians do, for one thing, because they care about it and they care about the context of it. Okay. You know, and they, of course, a lot of them studied in Hebrew. So,
have you? I assume you've read Who Wrote the Bible, Friedman's book. Yeah. Well, how good do you think his scholarship is? Because that Lane's question there brought to mind what Friedman talks about in his book, which I thought was interesting, about the two separate texts from both the Kingdom of Israel and the Kingdom of Judah, and you have the J text, and I think was it the E, where you have one using the Yahweh reference, talking about God. You have the other referring to God as Elohim. And how the two eventually sort of got interwoven, which is why if you read the Bible today, you'll read, that's why you have Genesis 1 has one creation story, and then Genesis 2 has a second creation story. And that's just the whole bringing together of these two texts that refer to God using different names. Right. And there are subtle differences in the way God behaves.
And in the language.
Yeah.
Right. No, that's pretty good. Like the documentary hypothesis is very well attested, and I think there's some excellent evidence for that. And that may have been what he was referring to. I'm not sure. But Yahweh and Elohim just means God or gods. And so...
Well, Elohim is plural, right?
Right. It can also refer to individuals, though. And it's used in some places to actually refer to kings, for example. To refer to a king, they'll call him an Elohim. So it's not necessarily a divine title.
Oh, okay. Okay. But a lot of the whole thing of naming God, it just has to do, again, with the history of it going so far back and what we can figure out about what people 3,000 years ago called God.
See, and just the book Who Wrote the Bible, that has got some pretty good scholarship. You have different opinions about all these things, which is one of the reasons that academic religious studies is different from what you'll see in a lot of more conservative Christian circles, because there's room for disagreement, and there's room for multiple points of view in saying, well, it could be this way, it could be that way, we don't have the evidence yet.
Sure. Unlike somebody like, these apologists like D. James Kennedy who, have dogmas to protect, right? Somebody just studying religion.
They're not looking for actual answers, they're looking for something to back up
confirmation,
what they believe.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, I think Tony's next, right? John is next. John is season line 3. Hi, thanks for holding.
Yeah.
Hey, what's up?
Well, I hope I'm not going to offend you guys too quick. I always do. But anyway, I was raised a Baptist, and I don't know if that has to do with anything. And I don't know if I have a question, but it seems to me that to think of religion as perhaps a necessary evil that is part of some social evolution that's going on, and that's my, perhaps, I mean, when you look at the history of it, and these symbols and metaphors that are all through the Bible, for instance, which is all I really know, that the beast, back in the old days, people were only able to look at the Bible in a linear fashion, like there's one beast, there's one Antichrist, but it makes sense to me that the idea that there's the Antichrist and the beast have been the authorities that have oppressed information or oppressed people or kept them back maybe for their own good in the same sense that religion did, and that maybe the Catholic Church, the people who actually put the Bible together, was the original beast or the original Antichrist, and not that it was the opposite of Christ, but that it was the substitute until Christ came back, and Christ being either like I don't mean Jesus coming back like a zombie, more the Spirit of Christ coming back to bring people together. It's really, to me, it makes sense as as kind of like a hippy dippy, fluffy duppy, futuristic kind of everything's going to eventually work itself out, and that's what the second coming is. And now, as we advance, you were talking about today's phenomenons and the UFOs and the technological explosion and stuff like that. That if we look at the Bible and that, or all writings really, it's not just the Bible, But if we look at them with those new ideas, that it makes sense in a new way, and that perhaps we're that the beast, is the United States military, and that they're bringing the world together in a false peace. I don't know how this is going to come out as a question. But
well, I think I understand what you're getting at.
Peace is being created by a world system, a military world system, and that after that, perhaps maybe a more spiritualized, peace that's based on spiritual principles rather than fear of military. And also, a real question may be, maybe the idea of hell. My personal belief is that hell is more of a motivator than heaven. The idea that I'm going to go to hell if I do something bad motivates me more than the idea that I'm going to go to heaven if I accept Jesus as my Savior. So maybe people needed the idea of hell in the past to keep them from doing stupid shit.
Well, who knows? That's certainly true for people in the past, and I guess it seems to be true for some folks today. But we'll go ahead and let Brian tackle your question, and thanks a lot. Okay. Oh, what do you think about all that? Where do you begin? Okay, I think I know what he's getting at. He was having a hard time articulating his point of view, but I think that, sure, one of the reasons I think religion has this capacity to endure, is the fact that modern day believers, can look at ancient writings that are sometimes, whether the translation is accurate or what have you, these are writings that are essentially meant to represent a certain outlook and a certain philosophy of life, and take modern events and, through virtue of their own experiences and their own outlook on life, just tie together the two things. Right. Say, well, this thing that was written 3,000 years ago has applications to my reality, or at least the way I perceive my reality today. Right. And that is how you get people. And again, it's not just the Bible or religious writings that you see people doing that too. There's the whole Nostradamus phenomenon. Yes. Prophecies. That seems to be what the whole prophecy industry is able to accomplish. The fact that you have these writings that are broad and general enough in a certain way and poetic in the way they are written, and that they can be interpreted, and believers who really want to think that there's some overriding horrible conspiracy going on that's out there to suppress them can just look at these things and say, oh, well, yes, that's what this means. The two flaming angels are clearly the planes that crashed into the World Trade Center, or whatever the heck it's all about. Isn't that?
And people look at Revelation. Revelation is the big one that everyone takes, and they take it out of context. If you put it in context, it makes sense for the times, and it's talking about specific things that are occurring then, and specific fears of the Christians. If you put it in context, it makes sense, and you can sort of work with it. But if you take it out of context, you just take something, and this is one of the things that I get very upset with, is people taking things out of context and just basically for their own purposes.
Sure. I used to watch TBN a lot back before it finally I started just having horrible pains. And I actually saw one of the shows where they're trying to raise money for their satellite television hookups. Where Paul Crouch took this one little verse in Revelation about angels in the heavens speaking to people, interpreted that to mean communication satellites. Yeah. And this is why you should donate money to TBN for their satellites. It was hilarious. It was so shameless. It was just like, you've got to be kidding me. Isn't that? I've heard some sources say that back up what you said, which is that Revelation was very much a contemporary and in some ways reactionary document to what was happening in the first century. Around about the time that Christians were starting to be persecuted in assembly line fashion. And I've heard that some people have worked out that the beast, 666, of the Antichrist of Revelation, was Nero, the Emperor Nero, who was the first who was known to have, he scapegoated the Christians for the big fire in Rome that everyone thinks he started. And so when the persecutions began, in mass, he was like, this is our persecutor. This is our great Antichrist.
Right. And essentially, the Hebrew and Greek, in both Hebrew and Greek, the letters also represent numbers. And so you can take the numbers and you can sort of add them up, and it adds up to Nero's name in Aramaic, I think, translated to Greek is 666. If you do that.
We're going to try to let Tony. Okay. Tony's been holding. And I don't think we're going to get any other callers after Tony, so don't forget the viewer feedback email, tv@atheist-community.org. Steve, go ahead and put that on the screen. If you have questions for Brian, we'll forward those to him and what have you. And talk about them next week or answer them online or what have you. So, Tony, okay, we got a couple minutes. Thanks for holding. Hello?
Oh, hi.
Yeah, you're on the air.
Oh, hey. Actually, I'm not Tony. I'm Dave again, the Five Gospels guy. But...
Dave. Okay. Well,
sorry.
all right. Well, then, if Tony's still on hold, going hello, sorry. Email us, please. There you go. Okay, Dave.
Just real quick, I just wanted to give you a little fact that I had found. I went through the Five Gospels after we spoke earlier, looking for this one thing. I understand this book is not. They have no axe to grind. It was just an academic study by a bunch of religious guys and secular guys.
Jesus Seminar? Yeah.
And they came up with their end result is that only 12% of the New Testament can they trace back to a historical Jesus, which means, 80-something percent, 88% or something is added later or misrepresented or something like that. Mm-hmm. I just thought that was an interesting fact I'd pass along to you guys.
Yeah. Well, thanks.
Okay,
thanks.
Take care.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for the guy who's on one. Hi, is this Tony?
Hello?
Hi, who's on line one?
Anybody?
I guess no one is. Okay. All right. So does that jibe with any of the research that you've done? Or?
Yeah, well, it's extremely difficult to say who he was. And it's hard to say if the Jesus Seminar actually had an axe to grind or not, because a
lot of conservative Christians think it did.
Well, and I think actually they did a little bit too. I mean, they had very good scholars there, right? But I mean, you get enough people in a room together, and not that it's bad research though. I mean, very good stuff.
It seemed to me that it would be difficult to put something like that together and keep everyone's biases out of it.
Right, exactly, and so.
But is there any indication that like the whole thing was the deliberate intent was to debunk the scriptures? I mean,
no, I don't think it was just to debunk the scriptures, but of course they are very liberal, and I've met a number of professors who have this real problem with fundamentalism, simply because they will, they take what these professors do and they do bad things with it.
Yeah, well, I think dogma would give anybody who values free thought and inquiry and skepticism a problem. That's just
real quick about one of the caller right before this one talking about. I don't know. It sort of gave the sense that
the identity of the Antichrist.
Well, that and like the whole. I just wanted to say, well, first of all, let me say again, I'm not a representative of the University of Texas, right? And I don't have animosity towards any religion. And I think that religion can be helpful, but you have to be very careful about it. You don't. I think the real problem comes when you take it too literally. It's like video game players. I think of religion a lot like a video game or like The Matrix. I really do. It's like, I think, for example, the Bible is my favorite book, and I've read it, and it's a lot of fun. And the more you know about it, the more interesting it is. It's sort of difficult to trudge through.
Well, like you said, it's a cool puzzle, and if you value great puzzles,
and
then you get a lot more out of it than somebody who says, well, here's this dogmatic list of rules.
And it's like
that makes no sense.
You read it and you get worldviews 2,500 years ago. You get this world that you can just immerse yourself in.
Right.
And it's the closest link we have to Mesopotamia because a lot of it came from that culture.
I guess
so the very birthplace of civilization, we have some writings that are directly related to that. So really...
Window into the past and into our past and everything else. Again, Brian, thank you so much. Very interesting information. You're a great guest. We'd love to have you back on another time. Seriously, for real, send us questions. If you have questions for Brian, we'll forward those to him, and he can answer you just about anything involving biblical and history of Judeo-Christianity and whatever you want to talk about.
I can try.
And if you just want to yell at us, you can do that too. Send us all your love letters and flames and no nude photos, thanks. But there we are, tv@atheist-community.org. And the whole thing about, just the fear of hell motivates me to do good more than the promise of heaven. Again, that creeps me out when people say that. I mean, it's just altruism should be enough. You shouldn't go around thinking that the only reason not to be a bad, dangerous guy in life is because you're afraid, that God is watching you and He'll hurt you if you aren't. That's doesn't seem to me a good way to be. Just
not a good way, just realistic. Why don't people speed?
Yeah,
because they'll get caught. Because they don't want the $100 ticket.
Or maybe you don't want to lose control of your car and die.
True.
That's kill someone else.
That's the better option.
Yeah, sure.
But
again, just so you know, just being
a lot
good.
of the wackos on the highway.
Being a good person should be its own reward. And that's our last 30 seconds. Thanks again for watching. We're here every Sunday 4:30, Tuesdays 4:30 reruns, nonprofit Saturday afternoon 2 o'clock. What did I leave out? I don't think anything. Thank you, Ashley. Again, Brian, very brilliant. And this was one for the archives. So, we'll see you next time. Visit our website, atheist-community.org. Theists, we don't hate you. We just think you're wrong. Thanks.
Everybody
Bye-bye.
have a good weekend.
And we'll sing da-da-da. We're going out.